This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. On this week's episode, we're looking at things that end up in unexpected places. 20 years ago, no one thought we'd be able to place a flying weapon across the globe from its pilot and engage in warfare. William Arkin discusses his book, Unmanned, Drones, Data, and the Illusion of Perfect Warfare. And then, when a young German Jewish woman sat for a famous portrait, no one thought it would end up the subject of one of the greatest art disputes in history. Nancy Moses discusses that and more in Stolen, Smuggled, Sold, on the Hunt for Cultural Treasures. But first, here's my interview with William Arkin. We talk about drones, and we talk about them to a significant extent. There's this idea that really what they are, and really what the change that they bring, is the idea that there's someone in California pressing a button, and somewhere in Yemen, something blows up. But you suggest that really it's not the weapon that's the big deal. It's something else entirely.
So drones, they're so common in our life today, and they're so ubiquitous even commercially, so that we think like they've always existed. But think about maybe your own smartphone, and 5 years ago what that looked like, and then 10 years ago what that looked like. And so drones are sort of the same. In 2001, when the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were hit, the United States had less than 200 drones, and today they have 11,000 drones. And it's not just drones. We have low Earth orbit satellites. We have more and more manned aircraft collecting information. We have more and more cyber intelligence. We have an NSA that can basically collect all of what is transmitted in the world digitally. So what the real explosion has been is not necessarily that man can fly, or that we can fly a remotely controlled airplane. The real explosion is in the data that is behind it.
In our modern warfare, we've narrowed down what is warfare about. It's about killing the right people. And we're racking up those kills. We're racking up those statistics. The question is, is that the right statistic?
It's important to also understand that the military is people, and increasingly they are what we call digital natives. In fact, 99% of the people in the U.S. military joined after 9/11. So they grew up in this world of instant information, of constant contact, of the assumption of broadband, of the assumption of Wi-Fi and text. And those, in fact, are all the tools that are utilized to now do killing. The more interesting question then is, well, what is war? You know, and I think, first of all, that we are so divorced from the process of this kind of intelligence, information-led warfare, that it was important just to write a book that says, hey, you know what, it's not just a matter of drones going out and looking for random people. This is a big data machine that has to operate in unison, and on some level, we should congratulate them for doing a job well done. Then we should say to them, but that's not the job we want done.
The way we won wars last century, and for centuries before that, however anyone won wars, was by great quantities of killing of some people who were actually engaged in the battle, and a lot of people who weren't.
If I trotted out a number right now and said, this is how many people have died in warfare since 9/11, the total might be a couple 100,000 people. That's a week in World War II. That's what's happened in 15 years. So we've become more humane in the sense that both civilians and the economy of war and civilian protections have grown enormously. Yet we still have not found the sweet spot, if you will, of why you go to war. So again, I'll repeat, why do you go to war?
And now, Nancy Moses on items that are stolen, smuggled, and sold. We have the imprint in our minds from Indiana Jones always saying, this belongs in a museum. But whose museum? And does it belong in a museum? And what are we preserving, and why, and for whom? These are really thorny questions that you get the sense for a long time people weren't asking them almost at all.
A lot of it has to do with how people who are now in their 40s and climbing up the ranks were trained in institutions to become museum directors. Before you became a museum director, because you knew somebody, because you know, it was a hobby of yours, and you came from a wealthy family. That's how it originated. And then there was a time when the people who became museum directors were trained as art historians or curators. They didn't have the management skills. That's really changed dramatically. And so folks who run museums now are much more adept at all of the security matters and all of the other tourism matters and marketing matters pertinent to museums.
That deals with kind of that cultural divide that you were talking about earlier, where it's almost like there are a bunch of Jews and probably citizens around the world who say, well, if something was actually taken from a Jewish family in wartime, why would we not automatically assume that it should end up back with that family? But there's this professional class of people who have an attitude that they're the only ones who can engage in preservation. They're the best place for all of these objects in the first place. There's a cultural connection between the place and the art and so on and so forth. What's going on there in that culture clash?
Those are exactly some of the reasons that I've heard and read about people saying. There's also a whole pragmatic side to this. Everybody has to prove beyond a shadow of the doubt that that object belongs to you or to your family in order for a museum to give it to you. There are very few records. I think of it like someone living in Prague or Vienna, knowing that the Nazis are going to invade the country, having to leave that day. Am I going to be able to carry out a big painting? Are you going to have the wherewithal to take the records that you own the painting? You know, a picture of it in your house, a bill of sale? People didn't.
That raises this curious moral question where you say, well, you know, all the statues from Assurbanipal should be where they were instead of in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and where have you. And now you see ISIS blowing up the ones that were left, right? And there's this question of, well, maybe actually this whole idea of like bringing things to museum and preserving them completely outside their context and so forth, maybe that's a net positive in light of what could happen? You know,
I'm okay with that. That analysis. But I think that there's ways to think about those objects in shared ownership, not just ownership by the museum. The ghost yard, for example, is not owned by the South Dakota Museum of History. They are stewards of it until the Lakota Sioux can raise money for their own museum. I think that's a legitimate point of view. But I would never advocate to emptying out the Metropolitan Museum or the British Museum or any of these other giant museums with things from all over the world. I don't think there's only one answer. It's too big a question.
That's all for this week's abbreviated web episode of Up Close. A reminder, you can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish channel on cable, or listen to the full audio of the show as a podcast available on iTunes and your favorite podcast player. The Jewish channel is available on cable, Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, IOPLING Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast on the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.